Well, hello, cutie. I'm back. And so are the lawn maintenance sounds. Today, we have another episode of Beauty and the Bibliophile. If you're new here, welcome to my channel and welcome to the Cute Life. I'm your cult leader, Leah. If you're not new here, thank you for returning for another cult meeting. As often as I can, I do a series called Beauty and the Bibliophile where I do my makeup and I tell you about the latest book that I've read. If you don't know what a bibliophile is, it is a lover and a collector of books. That is me. Today's book is Unbirthday, The Twisted Tale of Alice in Wonderland. And it is by Liz Braswell and it came out in 2020. Now, spoiler alerts, if you are thinking about reading this book and you don't want to know anything about it, do not watch this video. If you don't mind some spoilers and you don't mind knowing the ending, then this will probably be a good video for you, especially if you're just trying to decide if you want to watch it. I had to leave so much out of this book. There was so much going on. Also, if you haven't seen the original animated Alice in Wonderland by Walt Disney, you're not going to understand anything that's going on in this video or this book. So you should probably watch that first before watching this video. So yeah, if you want to hear the twisted tale of Alice in Wonderland and watch me do my makeup at the same time, I also did my hair in this one for a change. Stay tuned. I thought I would do my hair on camera today as well. You remember these things? Also, if you're interested in any of the products that I'm using, they will be listed in the description box below. All right, so Unbirthday, The Twisted Tale of Alice in Wonderland. And this is by Liz Braswell and it came out in 2020. So this story starts 11 years after the movie. Alice lives in Kexford, England, I believe is how you say it. I'm sorry if I'm not saying it right. You know how I am. Anyway, Kexford, England, during the Victorian age, and I think it's supposed to be the year 1865. She has taken up the hobby of photography lately, which was encouraged by her very artsy, kind of bohemian aunt. Now, the details of her dream of Wonderland had kind of dimmed from her memory a long time ago, but she remembers the vague feelings from the dream, feelings of magic and adventures and odd creatures, but she hasn't had another dream like that since either. I'm gonna let my skincare sit in for a few minutes before we move on to makeup. Now, the camera that her aunt had given her was a Fubus box camera, I think is how you say it. I'll put a picture right here. Anyway, Alice would use this camera to document all kinds of things about her life. And she would go on what she called photo walks. And that's how this story begins. She's on one of her photo walks. And she is looking for anything a little bit odd, a little bit curious, anything that kind of gives her that same feeling that her dream of Wonderland had given her. Today, she was headed to the square where a lot of the local children would play. A lot of them were orphans, and on this day, they were playing ball together, and she wanted to document this. So she goes to set up her camera and take some pictures. And as she's doing this, she hears a voice behind her say, "Oh, look, it's the famous English girl come to take pictures of the poor but pretty children." And Alice, offended by this, she turns around to see who says that. And it's this young man, he's a couple years older than her, and he's dressed very professionally. He's kind of good looking. He's got red hair, his hair's neat and trim. And he says, "So tell me," he's like, "do your patrons enjoy pictures of weeping crocodile tears?" And Alice is like, I beg your pardon. She's like, I'm not some sort of charity vampire here to exploit these children. I'm not preying on their sorry state. And this young man's like, oh, really? He's like, and what do you know about their sorry state? And Alice, you know, she comes to the square a lot. Everyone knows her as the girl with the camera, like he said. And she starts pointing at this child and pointing at that child. And she starts telling this guy all about their lives. Obviously, she had grown to know a lot of them intimately. And she ends it by saying, you know, I treat them with the same kindness and respect that I expect out of everyone. And the young man's like, oh, all right, I'm sorry. He's like, I judged you. He's like, I'm sorry, I was a scoundrel. And Alice is like, well, it's okay. But she's like, so who do I have the pleasure of addressing? And the guy, he takes off his hat and bows, and he's like, Katz, Abraham Joseph Katz, Esquire, barrister at Alexandros and Ivy. Barrister is a fancy word for a lawyer. He says, but you can call me Katz. And Alice, she goes to introduce herself, and he's like, interrupts her. He's like, oh, everyone around here knows Alice and her famous camera. Then he's like, maybe you could take a picture of me. And Alice is thinking to herself, she's like, this is a strange man to meet in a strange way. Normally, she avoided the men that her sister and others would try to push on her, or the ones that she just met on her own. Most of them were very dull. Mr. Katz, though, was something a little more intriguing about him. But she's like, oh, you know, I didn't bring enough film today. And he was like, oh, I was just joking about the picture. He's like, you know, it was my only way of making up for my insults was to offer you my handsome good looks. He's like, or he's like, I could come to your house and get rid of any rats that you might have. He says, I have a friend who's an expert at it. And Alice is like, no, that won't be necessary. And Katz is like, oh, you know, I don't know. If you let him get out of hand, one might even become mayor someday. And Alice laughs. He was obviously making some political commentary. And Alice is like, well, you know, I should be going. And Katz is like, oh, okay. He's like, well, come back soon. He's like, you're the most interesting person I've talked to around here in a very long time. So Alice gathers up her things. She curtsies and she says goodbye. Now she ran off to her Aunt Vivian's house. She wanted to go there to develop her pictures. Her aunt, being an artist and a photographer herself, had a dark room and would let Alice use it. Now, after the process of developing her pictures, she went to go and look at them. And she holds one up, and it was a picture she had taken of one of her neighbors and her children. She holds it up to look at it, but it's not a picture of her neighbor and her children. It was of the Queen of Hearts. Now, there was no mistaking it. Alice's neighbor nor her children were in the pictures. It was the Queen of Hearts, and she was holding her little heart fan and kind of waving it at the camera. Alice couldn't believe it. And the Queen of Hearts, she had this like kind of cruel smile, but also triumphant. Now later, Alice showed the picture to her sister, and her sister only saw the neighbor and her children, which was crazy because when Alice looked at it, all she saw was the Queen of Hearts. Now, Alice had only developed 3 other pictures besides that one. One was of Mr. Willard. He was the neighborhood hat maker, and also a picture of a little boy, and then a picture of a pine tree in the park. The picture of Mr. Willard, she had posed Mr. Willard behind his desk with like hats on either side of him. But of course, when she looked at the picture, it wasn't Mr. Willard. It was the Mad Hatter. And something like off camera had got his attention, so he was kind of looking off camera. And he didn't look so much mad as he did worried. So next photo of the little boy wasn't the little boy. It was a spectacle bird, like the one that she had met in Wonderland when she's feeling kind of her most lonely. And he was kind of like running across the photo, so he kind of had that like blurriness to him. Now Alice was amazed. Somehow her camera was seeing through the real world into Wonderland and channeling it. The last picture she had taken of the pine tree turned out to be a flower, but like a huge flower as big as a house, and it had eyes and a mouth. Now Alice thought this was fantastic. Turns out Wonderland, her dream, had been real this whole time, but she wondered why it had taken 11 years for Wonderland to make itself known to her. And also, why couldn't anyone else see it? She had been taking pictures of people for several years now. Why is it that it's just showing up now? So she had pictures of the Queen of Hearts, the Mad Hatter, a singing flower, and a spectacle bird. So every one of these pictures was like a glimpse into Wonderland. And she wondered what Wonderland really was. Was it some sort of world that just reflected their own in some way? Curiouser and curiouser. She decided there was really only one way to find out, and that was to go out and take some more pictures. So she only had 3 pictures left on her film. So the first picture that she took was of her cat, Dinah. She kind of assumed Dinah would be the Cheshire cat. Then she left her house and she took a picture of her friend Adina. She also took a picture of her Aunt Vivian, and then she took a self-portrait. So after she developed the pictures, she saw that Dinah, her cat, was just Dinah. So she reasoned that, I guess that means not everyone in her world had a Wonderland double. Some things in this world were only of this world. Next was her friend Adina, and she was one of those mirror-faced birds. And then the picture of her Aunt Vivian turned out to be the caterpillar. Very appropriate. Now, when Alice went to look at her self-portrait, Alice expected to just see herself. She was the only Alice in Wonderland, and as far as she could tell, the only Alice in her own world as well. But when she looked at it, she saw somebody else. Another girl about her age with light brown hair. She had a blindfold around her eyes, and dripping from the blindfold was thick black blood. The girl was disheveled and dirty. It looked like something out of a horror scene. Alice had never seen anything quite this disturbing before. As she was staring at it, it started to move. Now the person in the picture started screaming, and then she held up a banner that said "Merry Unbirthday." And Alice thinks to herself, she's like, who is this girl? She wondered if perhaps it could be Marianne, the girl that the White Rabbit had confused Alice for. Maybe they looked alike or something. But also, what do unbirthdays have to do with any of this? It was a mystery that she needed to figure out. So she takes all her pictures and she spreads them out in front of her on the floor. Now all the Wonderland residents in their pictures looked very upset or nervous, and she wondered if maybe they were purposely trying to get a hold of her somehow. Then she noticed in the picture of the caterpillar, the smoke from his pipe spelled out, "Help us." So now Alice was certain they were trying to contact her somehow. So after doing some thinking and some calculations, she realized that today was the exact day 11 years ago that she had fallen asleep under that oak tree while her sister had been reading her lessons. Now Alice thinks to herself, maybe there's something bad going on in Wonderland, and that's why they're trying to contact her. And maybe whatever it is has something to do with the Queen of Hearts. Maybe whatever's happening is so bad that they need Alice. Maybe this other girl that was kind of supposed to be Alice was indisposed at the moment and they needed Alice to save them. She's like, I must somehow figure out how to get back to Wonderland. So she thinks, well, maybe I should go back to the park where I had fallen asleep the first time, try to find that rabbit hole again, and try to kind of recreate that day as best she can. So at the park, she searched for a couple hours, and then she ran into Mr. Katz. And Mr. Katz was like, oh, hi. He's like, can I accompany you for a little while? And Alice was like, well, you know, I'm pretty tired. She's like, I've been out here for like 2 hours searching for a rabbit or rabbit hole or a place where I saw a rabbit once. She couldn't quite remember. So she's like, yeah, I'm awfully tired. And she goes and she sits down under a tree. And Kat sits next to her. So Alice asks Mr. Katz, she's like, what are you doing out here? And Mr. Katz is like, oh, he was like, I was on my way to see a friend. A friend asked me to do a favor for his friend, and he asked in the most friendliest way. He's like, that kind of sounds like a riddle, doesn't it? Anyway, he decided to take the long cut through the park since it was such a beautiful day. He's like, eventually I will have to go and see my friend since I promised. He's like, but tell me, he's like, what's so special about this rabbit or rabbit hole? And Alice is like, well, you wouldn't believe me if I told you, but I simply must find the rabbit. But she told him that she did need to sit and rest for a while. So he's like, oh, okay, I'll keep you company. And as she's resting, he's telling her a story, and his voice is very calming as she's watching the ducks on the pond. As she's listening to his story, all of a sudden she sits up. She's like, that's it, the pond. It reflects everything. It's exact opposite. She stands up and she goes running towards it. And she's thinking as she's running, she's like, well, cats must think I'm an absolute insane person. But since if he is chasing me and he hasn't caught me yet, I'm just gonna go for it. And she goes and she jumps into the water. And under the water, she was kicking and propelling her arms. And after a few moments, she propelled herself to the surface. Her head exploded out of the water, and she was sitting up, sprawl-legged, kind of awkwardly and very unladylike. And she was in a pool of water, something you would like see in ancient Rome. And everything around her was red. She stood up out of the water and she dried off very quickly. She's like, I did it! I'm back in Wonderland. Then all of a sudden, a wall appears with a single doorway in it, and it's all red as well. And through the doorway, she can see an all red forest. And when she walked through the door, she could see that there was some sort of public execution going on. There were bleachers that focused attention to the center of an arena. Now, all of a sudden, a horn sounded, and some prisoners were marched out. They were bound up and miserable, and marching them out was a org-like creature and an elephant that walked on her hind legs. And Alice gasped when she saw who the prisoners were. It was the Mad Hatter, the Dormouse, and the Dodo. And they all looked dirty and exhausted. And behind all them came what must have been the method of execution and the executioner in one. It was a giant creature with a black hood over his eyes. It had a snub nose and was razor-toothed, and its muzzle was wide and ready to bite heads off. And alongside of them were thousands of card soldiers. So Alice knew that if she charged them, it would be death by 1,000 paper cuts. And Alice says kind of out loud, but where's the queen? And a sheep next to her says, oh, she doesn't come to executions anymore. I guess we watched them for her. Then the prisoners were marched up onto a platform, and the executioner steps up, and Alice, not knowing what to do, she just screams, stop! And everybody does. Everybody stops and they all turn and look at her. And the announcer up on the platform, he turns and looks at her and he goes, well, this is highly unusual. And Alice is like, you release the prisoners at once. And the announcer's like, release them? He's like, they're prisoners of the state. Have you not heard their crimes? And he reads her the crimes, which are gathering with the purpose of undermining the queen's authority, spreading lies about the queen, stealing tarts, redistributing property properly seized by the state and eminent domain. He's like, all of this and you want to release them? And Alice is like, well, has there even been a trial with a judge and a jury? And the announcer's like, the queen does not need a judge. She is the supreme authority. And Alice is like, well, I don't think so. And the crowd kind of like looks at each other and kind of murmuring like, yeah, Alice kind of has a point there. And as Alice and the announcer are arguing, the Mad Hatter, the Dormouse, and the Dodo, they're not wasting any time releasing each other from their bonds. Then the Mad Hatter, he scoops up the Dormouse and he jumps on the Dodo's back. And the Dodo starts flapping madly and flies off with the other two. And Alice is thinking to herself, she's like, I thought Dodos couldn't fly. Oh well. And the announcer looks at Alice and he's like, you are responsible for the prisoners escaping. And Alice, she goes, oh, excuse me for a moment. And then she turns and runs. Now Alice could hear the card soldiers behind her, and she suddenly found herself in a maze, that same horrible maze that she had gotten trapped in the last time she was in Wonderland. But at least she was able to lose the cards. Now as she tried to find her way through the maze, suddenly she heard a voice say, you were never supposed to leave. And then all of a sudden, a mouth with a full set of teeth appears floating in front of her, and then a pair of eyes. And it was the Cheshire Cat. And Alice was very excited to see him, but she was like, what do you mean I was never supposed to leave? And the Cheshire's like, you were never supposed to leave, and neither were both of you. And Alice is like, yeah, but what do you mean? She's like, I didn't try to leave, I just woke up. And the Cheshire's like, well, yes, but you woke up too early. He's like, you didn't see it to the end because Marianne didn't end it then. And Alice is like, Marianne? You mean the White Rabbit's Marianne? She's like, she's the one that called me here. And the Cheshire responds with, well, like calls like. And Alice is like, so wait, are you saying that Marianne was supposed to save you or something? She's like, then why wait for me? And the Cheshire's like, well, why not you? He's like, you're all grown up now. You're as tall as you're gonna be. You can't be taller than your tallest. And Alice is like, well, of course I'll help you and Marianne if I can. But what exactly happened here? And the cat replies in his usual way with a riddle. He says, hands she has but does not hold. Teeth she has but does not bite. Feet she has, but they are cold. Eyes she has, but without sight. And Alice is like, well, you're no help. She's like, how does that help me find Marianne? And the cat is like, ask around. Keep your ear to the grunderground. And then he begins to disappear in front of her eyes. But before he totally does, he says, the answer is doll, by the way. And then he does disappear completely. And just as this is happening, something catches Alice's eye in the sky. It's the Mad Hatter, the Dodo, and the Dormouse. And they're falling. So Alice goes running off in their direction. Now at some point, Alice wasn't sure, the maze morphed into a forest. And when she came to a clearing, she found the Mad Hatter, the Dodo, and the Dormouse all having a bit of tea. And the Mad Hatter had a patch over one of his eyes. Now after saying their initial hellos, since they hadn't seen each other in so long, Alice asked them what was going on. Why was the queen doing all this? What was her intention? All they knew is that she was going across the land, burning everything, seizing people's property, executing people. She was executing anybody that stood up to her or questioned her. But why, they didn't know. And Alice is like, well, you know, it would help if we knew what her end goal was. When it came to, you know, croquet and cards, she just wanted to win. So was that the same now? Did she just want to win everything? Did she want to rule all of Wonderland? And again, the Mad Hatter was like, I don't know. For all we can tell, she's just rampaging until she destroys all of Wonderland, or until the great clock ticks its last. And Alice is like, well, okay, I guess we just have a mad Napoleon on our hands. She's like, we need to get a plan. We need to strategize. She's like, we need to find Marianne since she's the one that called Alice there. Then Alice asked the Hatter, she was like, how did Marianne find a way to contact me in the first place? And the Mad Hatter was like, well, she probably had to wait until your unbirthday, like your proper unbirthday, which is the 11th anniversary of your visit to Wonderland. He's like, I suppose she didn't have anything else to do in prison anyway but sit and wait and figure these things out. But the Dodo speaks up and he's like, well, you know, I've heard she's not in prison anymore. He's like, I heard she was out drumming up a resistance. And Alice is like, oh, she's like, could she be in a place called the Grunder Ground? The Grunder Ground? The Mad Hatter, he had heard of this Grunder Ground. He said that he could take her there. He pops open an umbrella. He turns it upside down and he sets it into a stream that Alice wasn't so sure would have just been there a moment ago. But he sets it upside down and all of them jump into it. She wasn't sure if they had shrunk or the umbrella had grown, but it didn't matter because they were headed downstream anyway. Oh, I forgot to show you. I'm using an appropriate palette. And I forgot my lashes. I'll be right back. Okay, got it. Now, when the umbrella came to the Sea of Tears, they all got out. And they came upon a very cute little English village. And beyond that, a forest. And hammered to one of the trees in the forest was a sign that said, inspected, free of traitors. Inspected by W. Rabbit. Now in the forest, she ran into the Knave of Hearts. And this worried and panicked Alice at first. He could be a spy for the queen. But he told her all about how he had stolen the queen's tarts and ran into the forest with them. So he was in big trouble. He definitely didn't want to see the queen again because she would probably have him executed. And Alice believed him because she remembered the nursery rhyme. The Queen of Hearts, she made some tarts all on a summer's day. The Knave of Hearts, he stole the tarts and took them right away. So she figured he was telling the truth. And when he asked to join their little party, she said it was fine. And as they continued on their way, Alice brought up the riddle to the Mad Hatter that the Mad Hatter and the March Hare had presented her with when she was in Wonderland the first time. So she asks him, why is a raven like a writing desk? And the Mad Hatter's like, well, I don't know. How is a raven like a writing desk? And Alice is like, no, you asked me that. She's like, I've been trying to figure it out ever since I woke up. And I think I have a few answers, so tell me which one is right. So these were her answers. So 1, because they both have quills dipped in ink. 2, Edgar Allan Poe wrote on both. And 3, because each can produce a few notes, though they are very flat. And she looks at the Mad Hatter proudly, waiting for him to tell her which one is correct. And he looks at her kind of sadly and he takes her by the hand gently and he's like, my dear girl, there is no answer. That's the point of a riddle. And Alice is like, that is not the point of her riddle. And she gets frustrated. She's just like, oh, never mind. Let's just go find Marianne. I think the answer, the real answer, is the second one. Let me know what you think. So they finally come to a sign in the forest that says Grunderground this way, with like an arrow pointing to a hole in the dirt. So they all make their way through this hole, and when they come out the other side, they're inside what looks like a really big tavern, or perhaps like a Viking longhouse. And there were creatures everywhere, and some were wounded, and some were tending to the wounded. And Alice asks the Mad Hatter, she's like, who are all these people? And the Mad Hatter's like, well, you know, I thought the Grunderground was just a place for like conspirators to meet, for the resistance to convene. But it kind of seems like these are all refugees from the Queen of Hearts war. The word must have gotten out about this place. And as he's explaining to her all this, a little girl goes by her and she's crying and she's saying, my doll, they took my doll. And Alice is like, well, let's find Marianne. She asked the Hatter, she's like, where do you think she is? And he was like, oh, probably in the secret room where the casino is, pointing to like a pair of like false cabinets. He obviously has been there before. So Alice, she goes over to these cabinets and she kind of slides them to one side, revealing a doorway into a room. Now inside the secret room, she saw the caterpillar with some other creatures, and she was very excited to see him, even though when he saw her, he was like, who are you? But she just blew it off, and she's like, well, where's Marianne? And they sadly told her that she had been captured by the queen and was dead. Now, while they were all grieving and trying to figure out what to do next, the ground started to shake and rumble. And right as this was happening, Alice noticed that the Knave of Hearts was missing. She didn't think it was a coincidence that right after his disappearance, this rumbling had started to happen. And all of a sudden, the walls caved in on everybody. And the next thing Alice knew, she was waking up. Now she woke up under the oak tree she had fallen asleep under. Katz was still there. And as she was waking up, she was saying, I have to go back. I have to go back. And Katz was like, you know, if you were anybody else, I would think maybe you were overindulging. But, you know, since it's you, I don't think that. And he ended up walking her home in silence, which Alice appreciated, that he could sense she needed some quiet time. Now, once she got back home, she really wanted to take a nap, thinking that sleep was the entrance to Wonderland. And she did fall asleep and take a nap. But when she woke back up, she was still in Kexford. Now, one evening, after an outing with her older sister, Alice ran into Katz on the street. And he asked her if she had ever solved her rabbit problem. And she sadly said no. So he asked her if he could tell her a riddle to cheer her up. And Alice, of course, loves riddles. And his was, I have mine and you have yours. It's needed in a painting. But in the end, none agree on the meaning of the thing. And Alice was like, oh, that's a tough one. She's like, what is it? And he's like, oh no. He's like, I can't tell you. You have to figure it out for yourself. Then Katz asked Alice if she would mind taking a picture of him and his friends that were with him, since she had her camera with her. And so she does. She takes a picture of him and his friends, and then they say goodbye and they both go their own ways. Now on another day, Alice ended up taking a picture of Mrs. Yao, the local tea shop owner. And when she developed her picture, she saw in her place a very tall, thin woman with dark hair and dark eyes. And she had her arms crossed over her chest, and she was holding some kind of a weapon of some kind, like a like a club. And Alice is thinking to herself, she's like, is Mrs. Yao a Wonderland creature in the suit of clubs? It was very odd. So far in all of Alice's adventures, she's never run into any creatures that were part of any other suit except for the hearts. And Alice is thinking to herself, there's another queen? Now, if there's another queen, surely she must be enemies with the Queen of Hearts. So maybe she would help them if first Alice could figure out how to get back to Wonderland. Now, one evening, Alice is coming home from the square where she had been taking some more pictures, and someone tries to mug her for her camera. And Alice is not gonna let just somebody take her camera, so she fights with this person over it. She gives the strap like one hard yank, and the mugger lets go. So Alice goes stumbling back, and she ends up hitting her head on the stone wall of a house that was behind her. And it really knocked her, so she started feeling kind of lightheaded and dizzy, and her eyes started to get heavy. And as she's like kind of dozing off, she notices, a little far off, a little garden. It was a very unique little garden, like nothing she had ever seen in Kexford before. Now this little garden actually looked a little bit familiar. And then she realized it was the White Rabbit's garden, and it was in front of the White Rabbit's house. She wasn't entirely sure why, but she decided to go inside. And she came across the dodo chained up inside of a little study. And he had a gash over one of his eyes. So she ran over to him and she untied him, and she told him to get out of the house right away. They went to leave. And as they were leaving, going down the stairs, she heard upstairs somebody crying. So she told the dodo to go outside and wait for her. And she went up to the second floor, and she went and found where the sound was coming from. And when she opened the door to the room where she heard the sound coming from, she saw the White Rabbit, and he was weeping. He was crying to himself, saying, "Oh, Marianne, you didn't deserve this." And he turns and he sees Alice, and he says to her, he was like, "I was only trying to help. I was only trying to do what I thought was best. I was just trying to stop the nonsense." And he was like, "We already had so many toys." And Alice is like, "What are you talking about, so many toys? Is the queen trying to destroy everything in Wonderland just so she can have all the toys?" And the rabbit is like, "Well, she wants all the toys, and I've been trying to help her acquire them." And Alice is like, "Oh, well, what a terrible little rabbit you are." And he says to Alice, he's like, "Take the dodo and go, because I'm gonna have to call the guards soon." So Alice kind of just slowly backs out of the doorway and runs out of the house. Now, once they were a safe distance away, Alice asked the dodo about the Queen of Clubs, what kind of a queen she is. And the dodo tells her that, oh, she's a very good and respectable ruler. He tells her that she and the Queen of Hearts had come to blows thousands of times, but luckily there was never any real serious game of war, because if there had, it would be a bloody affair indeed. So thank goodness they hadn't. And Alice is like, "Well, do you think she would help us?" And the dodo was like, "Why would the Queen of Clubs get involved with what's going on between the Queen of Hearts and her own people?" And Alice is like, "Well, maybe because she's a good card, hopefully." And the dodo's like, "Well, it kind of feels like we don't have a whole lot of options right now, so why don't we give it a shot?" And so they started on their way to go see her. Now, when Alice, after many adventures that I'm not going to go into because there's no time, finally gets to the Queen of Clubs, she's a very tall, slim, serene, reposed woman with very high cheekbones, and she has black shiny hair and black eyes that go all the way to the edge, so there's no whites at all. And she's wearing a beautiful gown with the suit of clubs all over it, checkers. It also had 6 pointed stars all over it. And the queen welcomed her with a gift. She gave her a wristwatch. Now, Alice had always wanted a wristwatch because it would keep her hands free when she was setting up her camera and timing exposures. Now, Alice tells the queen that she was there to ask her for help with an ailing people. She's like, I've come to ask for your aid against the Queen of Hearts. And the Queen of Clubs is like, oh, well, I've always been against the Queen of Hearts. She's like, we've played war many, many times. And Alice is like, well, who wins? And she says, well, sometimes we win, sometimes she wins. But honestly, I've grown bored of the game. And then the dodo chimes in. He's like, you know, some people say that it's not a proper game at all anyway. The cards are predetermined. There's no real strategy in it. And the queen looks over at him and she's like, we don't have time for this nonsense. She's like, as I've told you, I've always been against the Queen of Hearts. And Alice is like, well, Your Majesty, you know, I meant, could we count on you actively aiding us against her? As in, you know, help her people overthrow her. And when the queen heard this, she looked quite shocked, and it suddenly dawned on Alice why this idea might seem a little controversial, you know, to another queen. And Alice is like, Your Majesty, you know, she is out of control. She's executing people. She's stealing all their toys. And the queen froze. She's like, taking all their toys, you say? And I was like, yes, and it doesn't even make any sense why, or nonsense. And I was like, you know, I don't know what she expects to gain from all this. And the Queen of Clubs is like, well, she wants to win. Whoever has the most toys wins. Whoever has the most toys when she dies wins, of course. And Alice is like, what do you mean? And the Queen of Clubs is like, whoever has the most toys at the end of time wins. She's going to bring about the end of time and destroy Wonderland. And Alice is confused. She's like, but what does she win? If time ends, if it's all over, if everybody is gone, including her, how and what is she winning? And the Queen of Clubs is like, she just wins. Why is this so hard to understand? She is the winner if she has the most toys when we all die. And Alice says, she's like, okay, so she wants to acquire all the toys and then bring about the end of time to ensure that she has the most toys at the end and wins. And the Queen of Clubs is like, okay, finally, she gets it. And then Alice was like, well, do you think all the toys from all her subjects will be enough? You don't think maybe she'd go beyond her borders to ensure she has the most toys? Now this got the queen's attention, but the queen also saw through Alice's cunning. And she says to Alice, she's like, oh, I assure you, our toys are safe. She's like, we will not get involved in the affairs of another queen's. And Alice is like, please, Your Majesty, you don't understand. She's torturing and executing her own people, even those loyal to her. Then it kind of occurred to Alice that while the Queen of Clubs is a good queen, if she got involved in the affairs between another queen and her own people, what's to stop somebody else from doing that to her? Then the Queen of Clubs said to Alice, she's like, you know, if her own people judge that they are being ruled by an evil tyrant, then I may be obliged to lend a hand, maybe even a straight or a flush. And so Alice is like, okay, so you're saying if we can demonstrate that her own people are resisting her, you'll help with military assistance? And the Queen of Clubs was like, yes. So immediately Alice left to go back to Heartland with the dodo. And on their way, they recruited as many Wonderlandians they could as they were going back. They also ran into the Mad Hatter and the Dormouse again, and the four resumed as a party. So they had a long way back to Heartland, and on their way, they ran into many different types of creatures, trying to recruit as many as they could, and some they could and others they couldn't. And when they eventually got back to Heartland, they came upon a grisly scene. There were piles of rubbish everywhere, and they were all on fire. Then they made their way to the Queen of Hearts castle, since they figured that's probably where the final battle would commence. And on their way, they ran into a card who was like half scissors, and he was called the Card Cutter, and he was in charge of evening out the odds. And his intention was to kill Alice, and he succeeded. He stabbed her in the chest with his scissor half, and she was lying on the ground, and the Hatter was holding her hand, and he was like, "Go home, Alice." He's like, "But come back as soon as you can. You're no good to us dead." And Alice is like, "But I don't know how to get back." And then the blackness started to overcome her. Then she started to come to in an alleyway, and there were two little children standing over her. And they were like, Miss Alice, are you okay?" And a little boy was like, "They stole your camera." He's like, "But they left everything else," holding up the bag and showing that, you know, it was lighter than normal. So then she had the two children walk her to her aunt's house, since it was closer than her own. And once she was all recovered, she decided to go see Mr. Katz at his office. She had an answer to his riddle, and she also wanted to talk to him about a problem that she was having. So she knocks on his door, and she's like, hi. She's like, "I have an answer to your riddle. It's perspective." And he's happy, and he's like, "Yes, it is." And she's like, "Well, there's something else I kind of want to talk to you about, a personal issue, not a legal one. And I would like your perspective on it." So she sits down, and she's like, "You know, I'm afraid once I tell you this, you're never going to speak to me again. In fact, you might even take me straight to the madhouse." And Katz is like, "Oh, I don't know about that." He's like, "We're all a little mad here." And Alice looks at him. Now, for some reason, him saying this made her trust him. So she's like, "Well, I have to," and he's like, "Get back to that world." And he points at like a full-length mirror that he has on the wall. She looks over into the mirror, and instead of a lawyer's office being reflected in it, she sees a scene of a field with a checkerboard. There's fires and smoke. And she looks at Katz, and he's like, "You know who I am in that other world, don't you?" She thinks to herself, she's like, "Katz." She's like, "The Cheshire Cat." And he gives her a little bow. And she's like, "But how do you know all this?" And Katz shrugs, and he's like, "Well, how do you travel back and forth between here and Wonderland?" He's like, "The Cheshire Cat, he comes to visit me sometimes. He apparently can travel back and forth too." He's like, "He brings me riddles." Now Alice suddenly saw all of her interactions with the Cheshire Cat in a whole new light now. And it dawns on her that both of them, the Cheshire Cat and Katz, had been trying to help her this whole time through their riddles. And Katz is like, he's like, "Go back to Wonderland." He's like, "Save their world, but come back to mine." And he gives her his hand, and he helps her step through the mirror. And as she's like halfway through, she turns and looks at him, and he says, "Good luck, Alice, and remember, time is always on your side." or on your wrist if you're wearing a watch. And then she falls backwards into Wonderland. She found herself floating down to a checkerboard game. And come on, ColourPop, come on, look at this. I hate how, so the pencil part is actually like up here somehow and I can't get it out. There it is. See that? Hate that. ColourPop, hate it. She could see on either side of the checkerboard was an army of black and an army of red. And on the side where the red was were all those piles of burning rubbish. And there was one very tall hill of toys. And sitting on top of the hill was the Queen of Hearts. And Alice sees that she notices her floating down from the sky. Swear to God, I'm about to stop buying these. Then all of a sudden a griffin comes flying through the air, grabs Alice, and flies her down into like a little area where the forest came out into a peninsula on the battlefield, but it was a nice little safe place for people. And there was a small amount of some of the Wonderland creatures there, including the Mad Hatter, the Dormouse, and the Dodo. And Alice is like, oh, I've seen our plan has worked. The Queen of Clubs is here to save the day. So they all look out onto the battlefield and they see the Queen of Hearts and she's like, Rabbit, Rabbit, where are you? We need to do a final tally, Rabbit. But he wasn't around anywhere. So then she yells for the Knave and she's like, where is the White Rabbit? We're supposed to do a final tally. And the Knave is like, oh, I think he has left for the plane of time. He's about to push the clock forward. And the Queen of Hearts is like, what are you talking about? Why? We haven't done our final tally yet. We don't know if I have the most amount of toys yet. And Alice, she looks at the Dodo and she's like, I don't understand. Why is the White Rabbit going ahead to stop time if they don't know if she has enough toys yet to be the winner? She's like, where is this plane of time? And the Dodo tells her that, oh, it is very far away. You'll never get there in time. Then Alice notices the Dormouse about to eat one of those Eat Me biscuits. And she snatches it out of his hand very rudely. And she's like, oh, I'm sorry, but this is an emergency. And she eats it. Then she takes her hands and she like she's holding a ball or something. And she like spreads them apart. And in the space that her hands made, you could see a scene of a prairie. And in the middle of the prairie was a tall clock tower like Big Ben, if Big Ben went to 13. So apparently the Eat Me biscuits and the Drink Me drinks now enable Alice to make things happen with her hands instead of making her tall or short. Anyway, she steps into the scene. She tells her friends, wish me luck. Now once on the plane, she saw the great clock and it had a face and rosy cheeks and a smile, and its eyes went back and forth with the seconds. And she thought it looked quite friendly and cute for something that could bring about the end of the world. Then she looks over and she sees the White Rabbit, and the White Rabbit sees her, so he takes off running, and Alice chases after him, but you know, he's a rabbit and rabbits are just made for evading meat eaters, and he's zigging and zagging and leaping all over the field, and it's very frustrating for Alice. She can't turn like he can. She chases the rabbit round and round, and she ends up chasing him up a set of stairs that go around the clock tower up to the clock face. And she sees the rabbit has the hour hand in his paws, and he pushes it to 13, and then the ground begins to shake. So Alice grabs the hour hand herself and she tries to yank it back, but it won't budge. And then She remembers something somebody once told her. She couldn't quite remember who, but that time was always on her side or on her wrist if she's wearing a watch. And she remembers the watch that the Queen of Clubs had given her. And while everything was shaking, strange black and purple cracks appeared in the sky. So she grabs the little knob on her wristwatch and she pulls it, and everything all of a sudden stops. Everything is silent. Time was frozen. Everything was frozen except for her. So she pops open the watch face and she moves the hand back 2 minutes and 14 seconds, which was the point in time where she entered the plane. So then she positions herself in front of the rabbit with her arms out like a catcher. And she's thinking, you know, when she starts time again, he'll be so surprised to see her. He won't have time to change directions and he'll just barrel into her and she can grab him. So she gets in position and she pushes the button on her watch again. So time starts back up again. It takes several attempts, but Alice ends up catching the white rabbit and she grabs him and she's like, ha, she's like, your queen loses. I win. The world is now safe from your terrible mistress and your awful acts. And she turns the rabbit around to face her and he's crying. He's like, win? He's like, I didn't want to win. He's like, I don't care about winning. He's like, I just wanted the world to end so that the world without Marianne wouldn't exist anymore, and a world that where the Queen of Hearts is like hurting all these people wouldn't exist anymore either. She's like, wait a minute, you wanted to destroy the world, not the Queen of Hearts? And the rabbit's like, well, you know, she did want most of the toys, and once she got them all, she probably would have advanced time in order to cheat and win. He's like, but I didn't care about all that. I just wanted the world to be over and to restart with Marianne again. And who knows, maybe even the Queen of Hearts would have come back as like a better person. And Alice was confused. She was like, wait a minute, this clock doesn't end time, it restarts it? And the rabbit is like, well, it does both. He's like, have you never played a game on a timer before? It ends one game and starts another. Then all of a sudden, Alice hears cheering, 3 cheers for Queen Alice. She wins. She saved the world. And Alice stands up with the rabbit still in her arms. And then she feels a weight on her head and she feels a crown. And in the crowd of Wonderlandians, Alice sees the Queen of Clubs and she's smiling at her proudly. And she also sees the dodo and the dormouse and the hatter. And she also sees the Queen of Hearts in a cage on a wagon pouting. And Alice goes up to her and she's like, you are a vile creature who is never going to hurt anyone ever again. She's like, there is not a bit of nonsense in you and you don't deserve to live. And mostly you don't deserve to live in Wonderland. Then she's still holding the rabbit and she goes over to the hatter and he kind of gives her like a little leery look since she's still holding the white rabbit, the traitor. And she's like, it's okay. She's like, he just wanted to end the suffering. She's like, but it's okay now and we can all live happily ever after. And the hatter's like, yeah, we can. Or at least for, you know, the next hour or so. And Alice is like, yeah, for the next, wait, what? And the hatter, he's like, the clock. He's pointing at it. He's like, it's almost the end of the day. Everything's gonna start over. The world's about to end. And Alice is like, well, we have to stop it. And the hatter's like, you can't stop the end of the world, silly girl. And Alice is like, so this was all for nothing? And the Cheshire Cat appears at her feet. He's like, no, it wasn't for nothing. He's like, you won. He's like, you beat the Queen of Hearts, you prevented her from winning, and you caught the white rabbit. He's like, you won. And Alice is like, but we only have an hour left. And the Cheshire's like, well, all games come to an end someday, Alice. He's like, all dreams are woken up from eventually. And the Dodo's like, yes. He's like, the same game forever and ever would be boring. And the Hatter's like, oh yes, it's definitely time for a change. And Alice is like, but I don't want to say goodbye. And the Dodo was like, well, then don't. And Alice is like, well, but what do we do now? And everyone's like, well, whatever you want. You're the queen. And Alice thinks about it and she's like, I declare tea time and nonsense until the end of time. And everyone cheers. And they all lived happily until the clock turned 13. The end. That's the story, the twisted tale of Alice and what happened when she was very, very late. I think the lesson on this one was to bring your own perspective, to bring your own unique perspective to life's challenges. Now, how did I like this book? It was okay. I have to say it was okay. There was a whole bunch of stuff going on. I didn't even touch on so much. One thing, so when all this stuff was going on in Wonderland and she kept kind of going back and forth, I did not talk about any of the stuff that was going on in the real world. There was quite a bit of political messaging, I thought, that I did not like. It was very much obviously pushing a certain political ideology, one I personally don't agree with, just my opinion. There were even some lines straight out of a certain manifesto from someone with the first name of Carl. Anyway, without going too much into it, there was all that. If stuff like that doesn't bother you, you might still like this book. Now, the story of Alice in Wonderland is an amazing story, the original story and the original take that Disney had on Alice in Wonderland. There's all these rumors and stuff going around that this book, this story is based on some sort of psychedelic trip or that it was influenced from psychedelic trips. I personally, reading up on this book and the original story, didn't find that anywhere. I personally believe that this story is more about like the everyday annoyances and awkwardnesses that you run into. For example, the other day, went to get a pizza. Me and my husband, we go to get a pizza. We had walked in, ordered it. We were gonna go to the store next door, come back and get it, and go home, right? We do that. We come back to pick it up. And suddenly the place had gotten very crowded. There was nobody in there when we first went in there. And there's a long line of people to order pizzas. But there's another area where you pick up your pizza, right? So instead of standing in this huge line, we go to that window. My husband walks up and there's a worker there and he like won't acknowledge my husband, won't look at him. So Brandon's like, hi, we're here to pick up a pizza. I think it's that one right there. It was the only one because the only ones that had ordered yet. And the guy literally didn't even say words. He was like, like, I don't know how to help you, man. And Brandon's like, the pizza, it's right there. Finally, another worker comes over and she just hands him the pizza, but it's just like, what just happened? So, you know how daily interactions with the public and with people you don't know can be frustrating. Another example, I went to pick up some perfume I wanted. It was in a department store. I walk over to the women's fragrance counter and there's like 3 workers there. 2 of them are having a personal conversation and one is just literally just standing staring at the floor. So I walk over and I'm like looking for someone to say, can I help you? It was gonna be the easiest sale of their life. I knew exactly what I wanted. It was right there. Anyway, nobody's looking at me. So I walk over to the one that's closest to me, which is the one staring at the ground. And I like do a this. Hi. She's like, oh, hi. You know, and it's just like, what? You feel like you're in an alternate universe sometimes dealing with people. It's like, what is happening? Anyway, I think that's what this book is really about. Anyway, if you are interested in reading this book, I will link it in the description box below. It's not an affiliate link, it's just there for your convenience. And if you liked this story while I do my makeup and I did my hair, let me know. Let me know if you want me to keep doing the hair part too. Make sure and subscribe and hit the notifications bell so that you don't miss another twisted tale, another Disney book, another different kind of book. I read all kinds of books, not just Disney. And I will see you in the next one. Bye. Now the camera that her aunt had given her was a foo box. Foo. Now the aunt, Cameron, not aunt, Cameron. Cats. Joseph, no. He says, cats. Joseph, no. Abraham. Why you? He says, cats. Joseph, Abraham, no. Abraham, Joseph. And Alice laughed at his little joke. He was obviously, you know, poking at a political commentary joke. And Alice laughs. He was obviously making a commentary on political. Oh my God. And 3, because each one can. Since she had her camera with her.